Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
Death of the Living Snowman. Welcome to Mindful Musings, where we explore the mysteries that lurk in the quiet corners of everyday life. I'm your host, William, and tonight I'm bringing you a tale from the charming village of St. Mary Mead, as witnessed through the keen eyes of that remarkable elderly sleuth, Miss Jane Marple. Before we begin, I'd love to know, from which cosy corner of the world are you joining us for this wintry mystery? Drop me a comment. I read every single one. Now, settle in with something warm as we unravel Death of the Living Snowman. Chapter 1. The contest in the square. The village square of St. Mary Mead had been transformed into a winter wonderland for the annual Christmas Eve snow sculpture contest. Strings of coloured lights crisscrossed overhead, casting a warm glow on the pristine snow that blanketed the green. The Victorian lampposts had been wrapped with holly and red ribbons, and the scent of roasting chestnuts drifted from a vendor's cart near the church gate. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her warmest wool coat and matching scarf, stood among the gathering crowd, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail of the festive scene. "Such a lovely tradition," she murmured to her companion, Mrs. Bantry, who had driven over from her new seaside cottage especially for the event. Though, I must say, the sculptures grow more elaborate each year. Indeed they did. What had begun 5 years ago as a simple snowman building competition for the Church Restoration Fund had evolved into an artistic showcase that drew competitors from neighbouring villages. The local newspaper had even sent a photographer this year, and there was talk of the BBC featuring the contest in a segment about traditional English Christmas celebrations. This year, contestants had created everything from a detailed replica of the church spire to an ambitious rendering of Father Christmas's sleigh complete with 8 tiny reindeer. The Hendersons, still recovering from the fire that had damaged their cottage last spring, had crafted an intricate phoenix rising from frozen flames, a touching symbol of their own rebuilding. Near the war memorial, Dr. Haydock's nephew had sculpted a nearly life-sized angel with wings that seemed to capture real feathers in ice. At the centre of the activity stood Mr. Gerald Whitmore, the church treasurer, resplendent in an enormous padded snowman costume. The outfit was quite remarkable, pure white padding that made him perfectly spherical, 3 large coal buttons down his front, a bright orange carrot attached where his nose should be, and a tall black top hat perched atop the costume's head. The effect was so complete that from a distance he truly appeared to be a living snow sculpture himself. Children squealed with delight as he waddled among the sculptures, his muffled voice offering encouragement to the contestants and posing for photographs with the younger villagers. "Gerald does make rather a convincing snowman," observed Colonel Melchett's wife from behind Miss Marple, "though I imagine it must be frightfully hot inside all that padding." "The things we do for charity," added Miss Price Ridley, who had stationed herself prominently near the judging table. "Gerald told me earlier that the costume weighs nearly 2 stone, but he's worn it every year since we started the contest. Says the children expect it now." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, watching as Mr. Whitmore bent down awkwardly in his bulky costume to examine the base of one sculpture more closely. "Yes, one would think so. Though Mr. Whitmore has always been dedicated to the church fundraising efforts. He's been treasurer for, 15 years now." 17, corrected Mrs. Price Ridley, joining their group with her usual air of authority. "And a more devoted servant to St. Mary Mead's parish you'd be hard-pressed to find. Why, just last month he personally organised the jumble sale that raised £200 for the roof repairs, and the autumn fete brought in nearly 500. He keeps meticulous records of every penny." The competition was in full swing now. Martin Hewitt, the church handyman and a veteran of the Korean War, was putting finishing touches on an intricate ice angel, his scarred hands moving with surprising delicacy, despite the cold that must have been numbing his fingers. The piece was extraordinary, each feather on the wings individually carved, the face bearing an expression of such serenity that several onlookers had stopped to stare in admiration. Near him, young Tommy Fletcher and his sister Lucy were constructing what appeared to be an igloo, complete with a small tunnel entrance and what looked like an Eskimo family made of snow standing beside it. Their mother watched anxiously, occasionally calling out warnings about not getting their clothes too wet. Mrs. Patricia Dawson, the church secretary, supervised a group creating a nativity scene entirely from packed snow. She directed the placement of each figure with the same precision she brought to organising the church files, her notebook out, as she checked off each element of the scene. "The shepherds need to be angled toward the manger," she called out, "and mind the sheep don't look more like dogs." Miss Marple noticed how Mr. Whitmore paused longest at certain sculptures, bending down awkwardly in his bulky costume to examine them more closely. At the Hendersons' Phoenix, he spent several minutes running his mittened hand along the base as if checking its stability. At another sculpture, an elaborate castle complete with turrets and a drawbridge, he actually knocked on the walls, producing a solid thunk rather than the hollow sound one might expect. She observed him place small numbered cards beside each entry. Preliminary judging, she supposed, though the official results wouldn't be announced until 8 o'clock. But there was something odd about his method. He seemed less interested in the artistic merit of the pieces than in their construction, particularly their bases and internal structure. "I do hope the Hendersons win this year," Mrs. Bantry was saying, pulling Miss Marple from her observations. After their troubles with the fire last spring, they could use something cheerful. The insurance barely covered the repairs, and I know they donated what little they had left to the church building fund. Gerald was quite touched by their generosity, considering their circumstances. "Yes," Miss Marple replied absently, still watching Mr. Whitmore, "though I notice he seems particularly interested in certain sculptures over others. Look how he's examining that snow castle again." Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze. "Perhaps he's checking their safe. After that incident 2 years ago, when the Thompson boys' sculpture collapsed and nearly injured someone, Gerald's been very careful about structural integrity." As the church clock struck 6, its bells ringing out across the square in the familiar Westminster chimes, Mr. Whitmore announced through his costume that he needed to take a brief break before the evening judging. His voice was muffled by the padding, but the words were clear enough. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'll return shortly for the final assessment. Please enjoy the refreshments and the bonfire." The crowd barely noticed his departure, too entranced by the magical scene before them. Children were playing games around the sculptures, their parents chatting over cups of mulled wine from the refreshment tent. Miss Marple, however, watched as the rotund white figure waddled somewhat urgently toward the back of the church hall, his gait suggesting discomfort, or perhaps overheating in the heavy costume. She noticed he took an unusual route, not going directly to the church hall's main entrance, but instead circling around toward the back, where the old yew trees created deep shadows even in the afternoon light. The area behind the church hall was rarely used except for storage of gardening equipment and the occasional parish council meeting when items needed to be discreetly disposed of. "Curious," she murmured, but her observation was lost in the excited chatter of the crowd as someone lit the bonfire that would keep the spectators warm until the prize ceremony. The flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows on the snow sculptures and turning them into fantastic, shifting forms in the firelight. As she stood warming her hands at the fire, Miss Marple's mind catalogued the small oddities she had observed. Mr. Whitmore's intense interest in certain sculptures' construction, his examination of their bases, the solid sound when he knocked on walls that should have been hollow, and now his departure to the most secluded part of the church grounds. Aunt Jane, her nephew Raymond would later say, always noticed when patterns didn't match, and this evening, something in the pattern of the cheerful Christmas Eve celebration was definitely askew. Chapter 2. A Frozen Discovery. The church clock had just finished striking 8 when Reverend Leonard Clemson stepped onto the makeshift platform in the village square, clearing his throat nervously. The crowd, which had swelled to nearly 200 people, quieted expectantly. The sculptures gleamed under the strings of lights, their icy surfaces reflecting the bonfire's dancing flames. "Ladies and gentlemen," the vicar began, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "We seem to be missing our master of ceremonies. Has anyone seen Mr. Whitmore?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Patricia Dawson, the church secretary, glancing anxiously toward the church hall. The woman's gloved hands twisted together in what appeared to be genuine concern. "He went for a break 2 hours ago," called out Mr. Henderson. "Said the costume was making him overheat." "I'll check the vestry," offered Martin Hewitt, setting down his thermos of tea. "Perhaps he's having trouble getting out of that contraption." But it was young Tommy Fletcher who made the discovery. The boy had wandered behind the church hall, following a trail of coal buttons that had apparently fallen from the costume. His piercing scream cut through the winter night like a knife. Miss Marple was among the first to reach the scene, her elderly frame moving with surprising swiftness. There, propped against the back wall of the church hall, sat the Snowman, or rather, Mr. Gerald Whitmore in his Snowman costume, completely still, his padded form covered in a layer of frost that made him appear to be an actual snow sculpture. "Don't touch anything," Miss Marple said sharply as several people pressed forward. "Someone fetch Dr. Haydock immediately." The doctor arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand. The crowd was ushered back, but Miss Marple remained, watching intently as Dr. Haydock conducted his preliminary examination. The costume made it difficult, the padding was frozen solid, and the carrot nose had to be removed before the doctor could properly examine Whitmore's face. "Dead," Dr. Haydock announced grimly. "Has been for at least 2 hours, I'd say. Hypothermia by the look of it. Poor fellow must have collapsed and frozen in this dreadful cold." "How terrible," whispered Mrs. Price Ridley. "And on Christmas Eve." But Miss Marple had noticed something the others had missed. The positioning of the body was all wrong. Whitmore wasn't slumped as one might expect from someone who had collapsed from cold. He was arranged almost decoratively against the wall, and there were strange marks in the snow around him. Not footprints exactly, but long drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled across the ground. "Doctor," she said quietly, moving closer to Dr. Haydock, "might you examine the back of his head, just to be thorough?" Dr. Haydock gave her a sharp look, but complied, carefully feeling through the costume's padding. His expression changed immediately. "Good God," he muttered. "There's blood here, and a depression in the skull." The doctor carefully removed more of the costume, revealing an ugly wound on the back of Gerald Whitmore's head. "This man didn't die of hypothermia," he announced to the shocked gathering. "He was struck with something heavy. The cold came after." Within the hour, Inspector Slack had arrived from Much Benham, his perpetual scowl even more pronounced than usual. He immediately cordoned off the area and began barking orders at the local constable. "Accident, most likely," Slack declared after his initial examination. "Slipped on the ice, hit his head on something. The cold finished him off." "I think not, Inspector," Miss Marple interjected mildly. "You see those icicles on the church hall's guttering? They're all intact except for one section directly above where Mr. Whitmore was found. And look at the pattern of ice on his costume. It's been sprayed on, not formed naturally." Inspector Slack turned to her with barely concealed irritation. "And what exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I'm suggesting that someone killed Mr. Whitmore elsewhere and then moved his body here, arranging it to look like he'd frozen to death. The killer even sprayed water on the costume to create the illusion of natural freezing. Quite clever, really, though they didn't account for the icicles." As the implications of her words sank in, the crowd began to disperse, voices hushed and fearful. Christmas Eve had taken a decidedly dark turn in St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple knew that beneath the village's peaceful facade, a killer walked among them. Chapter 3. Hollow Sculptures and Hidden Secrets. The morning after Christmas brought no joy to St. Mary Mead. The village square, which should have been filled with families admiring the snow sculptures, was instead cordoned off with police tape. Inspector Slack had commandeered the church hall as his temporary headquarters, and the sound of his gruff voice could be heard berating the local constable through the thin walls. Miss Marple, however, had risen early and was conducting her own quiet investigation. She stood before the prize-winning sculptures, her keen eyes studying their construction with particular interest. The Henderson family's magnificent ice castle, which would have won first prize, seemed oddly heavy for its size. When she tapped it gently with her umbrella, it didn't ring with the hollow sound she expected. "Curious about the sculptures, Miss Marple?" She turned to find Mrs. Patricia Dawson approaching, dark circles under her eyes suggesting a sleepless night. The church secretary carried a ledger under her arm and appeared to have aged years overnight. "They are remarkably well crafted," Miss Marple replied carefully, "though I notice some have rather thick walls for ice sculptures. One would think they'd be more delicate." Mrs. Dawson's face tightened. The contestants were Quite competitive this year. Everyone wanted to win the £50 first prize. She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "Miss Marple, there's something I think you should know. About Gerald and the church funds." Before she could continue, Martin Hewitt appeared, his tools clanking in the canvas bag over his shoulder. "Morning, ladies. Inspector wants the sculptures moved to clear the square. Shame to destroy them, but orders are orders." "Wait," Miss Marple said suddenly. "Mr. Hewitt, would you mind carefully breaking open the base of that castle? I believe Inspector Slack would be most interested in what's inside." Hewitt looked puzzled but complied, using his ice pick with practiced precision. As the frozen wall cracked and fell away, several waterproof packages tumbled onto the snow. Mrs. Dawson gasped. Hewitt stood frozen, staring at what appeared to be bundles of pound notes wrapped in plastic. "Fetch Inspector Slack immediately," Miss Marple instructed Hewitt, who departed at a run. She turned to Mrs. Dawson. "You knew about this, didn't you?" The secretary sank onto a nearby bench, her composure finally cracking. "I discovered it 3 days ago. Irregularities in the church accounts going back 2 years. Thousands of pounds missing. Collection money, fundraising proceeds, charitable donations. I confronted Gerald on the 22nd. And what did he say? He claimed he'd invested it all, that he'd double our money by New Year's. He begged me not to tell Reverend Clemson until after Christmas. Said he'd return everything with interest." Her voice turned bitter. I was a fool to believe him, even for a moment. Inspector Slack arrived, red-faced and breathing heavily. His eyes widened at the sight of the money scattered on the snow. "What in blazes is this?" "Evidence of embezzlement, Inspector," Miss Marple explained calmly. "I suspect if you examine the other winning sculptures, you'll find more hidden packages. Mr. Whitmore was using the contest to hide stolen church funds, planning to retrieve them after the sculptures melted naturally. Over the next hour, they systematically examined each sculpture. 5 contained money, nearly £8,000 in total. The nativity scene alone held £3,000 frozen into the base of the manger. Reverend Clemson arrived as they were cataloguing the last of it, his kindly face stricken with disbelief. "I trusted him completely," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Gerald managed our finances for 17 years. How could I have been so blind?" "You weren't blind, Vicar," Miss Marple said gently. "You were trusting, which is what one expects from a man of God. Mr. Whitmore counted on that trust." Young Tommy Fletcher, who had been watching from behind his mother, suddenly piped up. "I saw someone arguing with the Snowman yesterday. Behind the church hall around 6 o'clock. They were pushing him and shouting." Inspector Slack rounded on the boy. "Why? Didn't you mention this yesterday?" Tommy shrank back. "I was scared, and I couldn't see who it was properly. They wore a long dark coat with the collar turned up." Miss Marple noticed Martin Hewitt had gone very still, his weathered face expressionless. She also observed that Mrs. Dawson kept glancing at the church memorial board, where a brass plaque commemorated those who had donated to various church causes, including Hewitt's late wife, Mary, whose contribution toward a hospital wing had been among the largest. The investigation had taken a new turn, and Miss Marple sensed they were drawing closer to the truth of who had ended Gerald Whitmore's embezzlement scheme with such violent finality. Chapter 4. The Veteran's Grief. The interior of Martin Hewitt's workshop behind the church was a testament to a craftsman's skill. Tools hung in perfect order on the walls, chisels, picks, hammers and saws, each in its designated place. The workbench bore the scars of countless projects, and wood shavings covered the floor like pale snow. Inspector Slack stood in the doorway, his notebook in hand, while Miss Marple examined the space with her characteristic attention to detail. "Mr. Hewitt," the inspector began, "we need to discuss your whereabouts yesterday evening between 6 and 7 o'clock." The veteran stood rigidly, his hands clasped behind his back in an almost military posture. "I was working on the Ice Angel until about 5:30. Then I went to my workshop to put away my tools and clean up. I returned to the square around 7 for the bonfire lighting." Miss Marple noticed a small pile of coal dust on the workbench, partially swept into a corner as if someone had tried to clean it hastily. Near it lay an ice chisel, its blade recently cleaned, but with tiny dark specks still visible in the groove where the blade met the handle. "That's a fine collection of tools, Mr. Hewitt," she observed. "You must have invested considerably in them." "My wife bought most of them for me," Hewitt replied, his voice softening. "Said a craftsman deserved proper equipment. Spent near a month's wages on that set of chisels alone, bless her soul." "Your wife passed away 2 years ago, didn't she?" Miss Marple asked gently. "From cancer, I believe." Hewitt nodded, his jaw tightening. 2 years this past November. The hospice took wonderful care of her in those final weeks. That's why Mary wanted to donate to the new hospital wing, £3,000 from her life insurance. She said she wanted other families to have the same comfort we did. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. According to the church records, that donation was made 18 months ago. Aye, it was. Hewitt's voice had grown dangerously quiet. Or so I thought until 3 days ago. The workshop fell silent except for the distant sound of children playing in the snow. Miss Marple moved closer to examine a framed photograph on the wall. Martin and Mary. Hewitt on their wedding day, both young and radiant with hope. "You discovered the donation never reached the hospital," Miss Marple said. It wasn't a question. Hewitt's hands clenched into fists. "I went to check on the plaque they were supposed to install. Mary Hewitt Memorial Wing, it was going to say. But they'd never heard of any donation. No record of it. Nothing." "So, you confronted Mr. Whitmore," Inspector Slack said. "I did more than confront him," Hewitt spat. "I demanded answers. He fed me some story about paperwork delays, banking errors, lies, all of it. My Mary's final wish, and he'd stolen it to feed his gambling habits." Miss Marple noticed something else, a dark coat hanging on a peg, still damp from snow. "Is this the coat you wore yesterday evening, Mr. Hewitt?" He glanced at it briefly. "Yes. Why?" "Young Tommy Fletcher saw someone in a dark coat arguing with Mr. Whitmore behind the church hall around 6 o'clock, Inspector Slack said, his eyes narrowing. "Care to revise your statement about your whereabouts?" Hewitt stood straighter, meeting the inspector's gaze directly. "All right. Yes, I went to speak with him during his break. I wanted to give him one last chance to make things right." "And did he?" Miss Marple asked. "He laughed." The words came out like broken glass. "Stood there in that ridiculous snowman costume and laughed. Said the money was gone and there was nothing I could do about it. Said who'd believe a damaged war veteran over the respected church treasurer." The temperature in the workshop seemed to drop. Inspector Slack stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised her hand slightly, encouraging Hewitt to continue. "My Mary saved every penny for that donation," Hewitt said, his voice breaking. "Went without new clothes, mended everything twice over, just so others wouldn't suffer like she did. And he took it for gambling, for cards and horses and God knows what else." "Mr. Hewitt," Inspector Slack said formally, "I must ask you directly, did you strike Gerald Whitmore?" The veteran's shoulders sagged, all military bearing suddenly gone. He looked older, defeated. "I picked up my ice chisel just to threaten him, to make him understand how serious I was. But he laughed again and turned to walk away. Something inside me just snapped." The confession hung in the air like frozen breath. Miss Marple observed the man before her with deep sadness, a good man driven to a terrible act by grief and righteous anger. "I need you to come with me, Mr. Hewitt," Inspector Slack said, not unkindly. "We'll need a formal statement." As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple noticed one more thing, a small notebook on the workbench, filled with meticulous records of donations Martin had tracked, trying to understand where his wife's money had gone. The last entry was dated December 21st. "Confirmed with hospital, no donation received. Gerald Whitmore is a thief and a liar. Mary deserves justice. Chapter 5. The Treasurer's Gambit." The interview room at Much Benham Police Station was austere and cold, its green walls seeming to leach warmth from anyone who entered. Martin Hewitt sat across from Inspector Slack, his calloused hands folded on the metal table. Miss Marple had been permitted to observe, seated quietly in the corner with her knitting needles clicking softly. "Let's go through this again," Inspector Slack said, his pencil poised over his notebook. "You struck Mr. Whitmore with the ice chisel at approximately 6:15 yesterday evening." "Yes." Hewitt's voice was steady now, resigned. Once. I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to feel something. Pain, fear, anything that might make him understand what he'd done. And then, the inspector prompted, he fell forward into the snow. The costume made him top-heavy. I thought he'd just been knocked unconscious. I panicked and ran back to my workshop. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. Mr. Hewitt, you say Mr. Whitmore fell forward? Yes, face first into the snowbank. How curious, she murmured. Because he was found propped against the church hall wall facing outward. Hewitt frowned. That's not possible. I left him where he fell. Inspector Slack leaned forward. Are you changing your story, Hewitt? No. I'm telling you exactly what happened. I hit him once, he fell forward, and I fled. Someone else must have moved him. Miss Marple's needles stopped their motion. Inspector, might I suggest we examine the timeline more carefully? Dr. Haydock estimated death occurred around 6 o'clock. Mr. Hewitt says he struck Mr. Whitmore at 6:15. Young Tommy saw the argument at 6 o'clock. Perhaps the boy was mistaken about the time, Slack suggested. I think not, Miss Marple said. Tommy is quite reliable, and he specifically remembered hearing the church clock strike 6 just before he saw the figures arguing. Mr. Hewitt, are you certain about your timing? The veteran considered carefully. I checked my watch when I left my workshop. It was 6:10. The walk to the church hall takes 5 minutes. Then someone else was with Mr. Whitmore at 6 o'clock, Miss Marple concluded. Someone who may have struck the fatal blow before you arrived. Inspector Slack's scowl deepened. You're suggesting we have 2 attackers? Before Miss Marple could respond, Constable Briggs knocked and entered. Inspector, we've been going through Mr. Whitmore's personal effects. You should see this. He handed over a leather-bound appointment diary. Inspector Slack flipped through it, his expression growing more puzzled with each page. Look at this. December 21st. PD knows. Must convince her to wait. December 22nd. MH asking questions. Dangerous. December 23rd. Final warning received. They won't wait past Christmas. PD. Patricia Dawson, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. MH. Martin Hewitt. But who delivered the final warning? There's more, Constable Briggs added. We found betting slips in his home, thousands of pounds in debts to some unsavoury characters in London, the kind who don't accept delayed payments. Miss Marple rose from her chair. Inspector, I believe we need to speak with Mrs. Dawson again, and perhaps examine the church secretary's office more thoroughly. They drove back to St. Mary Mead in Inspector Slack's car, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered village. The church hall was quiet, most of the villagers staying indoors, away from the scene of the tragedy. Mrs. Dawson was in her office, sorting through financial records with mechanical precision. She looked up as they entered, her face pale but composed. I've been organising everything for the audit, she said. The bishop will want a full accounting. Mrs. Dawson, Miss Marple began gently, you discovered the embezzlement on December 21st. What exactly did you do then? The secretary's hand stilled. I confronted Gerald immediately. He broke down, admitted everything. The gambling debts, the stolen funds. He begged me for time. And you agreed? For 48 hours only. I told him if the money wasn't returned by Christmas Eve, I would go to the police. She paused. I also informed someone else, someone who had a right to know. Who? Inspector Slack demanded. Mrs. Dawson hesitated, then pulled out a file. Reverend Clemson's wife. She's the daughter of old Mrs. Pemberton, who left the church £10,000 in her will last year. Nearly half of that was missing. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. Mrs. Clemson, refined, gentle, always perfectly composed Mrs. Clemson, had never mentioned this connection. Where is Mrs. Clemson now? Inspector Slack asked urgently. She said she was visiting her sister in London for Christmas, Mrs. Dawson replied. She left on the late train yesterday evening. But Miss Marple was already shaking her head. No, Inspector. I saw Mrs. Clemson at the station yesterday afternoon. She was arriving, not departing, and she was carrying a small valise that seemed unusually heavy for an overnight case. The truth was beginning to crystallise, as clear and sharp as the ice sculptures in the village square. Chapter 6. Footprints in fresh snow. The vicarage stood at the end of Church Lane, its Victorian Gothic architecture softened by the blanket of snow that covered its steep roof and garden walls. Inspector Slack rang the doorbell repeatedly, but no answer came from within. Through the frosted windows, the house appeared dark and still. "The Reverend is at the hospital," Miss Marple informed them. "Visiting parishioners. He goes every Boxing Day without fail." "And Mrs. Clempson is supposedly in London," Inspector Slack muttered. "Convenient." "I think not," Miss Marple said, studying the fresh footprints leading around the side of the house. These were made, recently, within the last hour. A woman's boots, from the size and stride. They followed the tracks through the garden gate and around to the back door, which stood slightly ajar. Inspector Slack pushed it open cautiously, calling out, "Police! Is anyone home?" The kitchen was tidy but cold, as if the range hadn't been lit that morning. On the table sat an untouched cup of tea, a skin of milk formed on its surface. Beside it lay a train ticket to London, dated for the previous evening but clearly unused. "She never left," Inspector Slack said grimly. They found Mrs. Clempson in the study, seated at her husband's desk with her head in her hands. She looked up as they entered, and Miss Marple was struck by how much she had aged in just 2 days. Her usually immaculate hair was dishevelled, and her eyes were red with weeping. "I've been expecting you," she said quietly. "I suppose Martin Hewitt told you everything." "Mr. Hewitt confessed to striking Mr. Whitmore," Inspector Slack said carefully. "But there are inconsistencies in the timeline." Mrs. Clempson laughed bitterly. "Poor Martin. He thinks he killed Gerald, doesn't he? But Gerald was already dead when Martin found him." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Miss Marple moved to the window, observing the view of the church hall barely visible through the yew trees. "You were the first to confront him," Miss Marple said. It wasn't a question. "My mother's money," Mrs. Clempson said, her voice hardening. £10,000 she scrimped and saved her entire life. She lived like a pauper, so the church would have funds for the poor after she died, and Gerald stole it for gambling. She stood abruptly, pacing to the bookshelf where a photograph of an elderly woman smiled benignly from a silver frame. "Patricia Dawson told me 3 days ago. She thought I had a right to know before she went to the police. I couldn't let it become public. The scandal, the shame it would bring on Leonard. He's such a good man, so trusting." "So you decided to handle it yourself," Inspector Slack said. "I went to Gerald during the contest. Found him behind the church hall during his break, already out of that ridiculous costume head, trying to cool down. I had Mother's walking stick with me, heavy silver handle, you know the type. I demanded he return the money immediately." Miss Marple turned from the window. And his response? "He laughed, said the money was already hidden where no one would find it until he was ready to leave the country. He was planning to disappear after New Year's, you see. Leave his debts, his crimes, everything behind." Mrs. Clempson's hands clenched. "I didn't mean to strike him, but when he turned his back on me, dismissing me like I was nobody, something came over me. Mother's stick was in my hand, and suddenly Gerald was on the ground." "Then what did you do?" Inspector Slack asked, writing furiously. "I panicked. But then I heard someone coming. It must have been Martin. I hid behind the yew trees and watched as he argued with what he thought was Gerald in the costume. When Martin struck the figure and ran, I realised he'd given me the perfect cover." "So you arranged the scene," Miss Marple said. "Dressed Gerald back in the costume, propped him against the wall, even sprayed water to create the freezing effect." "The garden hose was right there," Mrs. Clempson admitted. "It seemed like divine providence. Everyone would think he'd frozen to death, or if violence was discovered, Martin would be blamed. He'd been so publicly angry about the missing donation." "But you didn't know about the money hidden in the sculptures," Miss Marple observed. "Not until this morning when they found it. £5,000 of it was Mother's money." Her voice broke. "It was all there, frozen in ice like Gerald's heart." Inspector Slack stood formally. "Mrs. Eleanor Clempson, I'm arresting you for the murder of Gerald Whitmore." As he cautioned her, Mrs. Clempson looked at Miss Marple with desperate eyes. "What will happen to Leonard? This will destroy him." "Your husband is stronger than you think," Miss Marple said gently. "The truth, however painful, is always better than living a lie." He'll survive this, and the parish will support him. As they led Mrs. Clempson away, Miss Marple remained in the study, looking at the photograph of old Mrs. Pemberton. The elderly woman's face seemed to hold a trace of sadness, as if she somehow knew her final act of charity would lead to such tragedy. Chapter 7. The Weight of Confession. The police station at Much Benham had become a hub of confused activity. In one interview room sat Martin Hewitt, still insisting he had killed Gerald Whitmore. In another, Mrs. Eleanor Clempson maintained with equal conviction that she had struck the fatal blow. Inspector Slack paced the corridor between them, his frustration evident in every heavy footstep. "This is absurd," he declared to Miss Marple, who sat on a bench reviewing the witness statements. "They can't both have killed him. The medical evidence shows only one major blow to the head." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her fingers running along the edge of a statement. "And yet both are telling the truth as they understand it. The question is, Inspector, which blow was actually fatal?" Dr. Haydock arrived, looking harried. "You asked for my preliminary autopsy findings urgently?" "Two people have confessed to striking Whitmore," Slack explained. "We need to know if there were multiple injuries." The doctor consulted his notes. The skull shows evidence of two distinct impacts. The first, near the base of the skull, caused severe trauma, but might not have been immediately fatal. The second, slightly higher, and delivered with considerably more force, caused massive hemorrhaging. "Two blows," Miss Marple murmured. "Mrs. Clempson struck first with her mother's walking stick, then Mr. Hewitt arrived, and struck what he thought was a conscious man." "But which blow killed him?" Inspector Slack demanded. "Without more detailed examination, impossible to say definitively," Dr. Haydock admitted. "Either could have been fatal. Together, they certainly were." Miss Marple stood suddenly. "Inspector, might I speak with both suspects? There's something we're missing." In the first interview room, Martin Hewitt looked up wearily as they entered. "Is it over? Will you charge me now?" "Mr. Hewitt," Miss Marple said gently, "when you struck Mr. Whitmore, did he make any sound? Any movement?" Hewitt frowned, thinking, "No, but I thought that was because of the costume padding. It must have muffled everything." "And you're certain he fell forward?" "Absolutely. Face first into the snow." They moved to Mrs. Clempson's room. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded, looking every inch the vicar's wife despite her circumstances. "Mrs. Clemson," Miss Marple began, "after you struck Mr. Whitmore, did he fall?" "Yes, backward. He crumpled against the church wall." "Was he breathing?" Mrs. Clemson hesitated. I didn't check. I heard someone coming and fled." Miss Marple exchanged glances with Inspector Slack. "I believe, Inspector, that Mr. Whitmore was still alive when Mrs. Clemson left him, though gravely injured. When Mr. Hewitt arrived minutes later, Whitmore had managed to get partially back into his costume, perhaps trying to get help or simply operating on instinct." "So, Hewitt struck a dying man?" Slack asked. "A dying man who appeared to be standing and walking," Miss Marple corrected. "Mr. Hewitt's blow was certainly the coup de grace, but would Whitmore have survived Mrs. Clempson's attack? Dr. Haydock suggests not." The legal implications were staggering. Inspector Slack rubbed his forehead. "This is a mess. The Crown Prosecutor will have to sort out charges." A commotion in the corridor drew their attention. Reverend Clempson had arrived, his gentle face drawn with anguish. "Please, I must see my wife." The reunion was painful to witness. Leonard Clempson took his wife's hands, tears streaming down his face. "Eleanor, why didn't you tell me?" "How could I?" she sobbed. "Your trusted treasurer stealing from the church? And Mother's money? I wanted to protect you from the scandal." "We would have faced it together," he said softly, "as we'll face this now." Meanwhile, young Constable Briggs had been investigating the gambling connections. "Inspector, those betting slips we found, they link to a London syndicate known for violent debt collection. They've been sending threatening letters to Whitmore for months." "So, he was desperate," Miss Marple observed. "Desperate enough to steal from the dead and hide it in plain sight, planning to vanish with the money after Christmas." Patricia Dawson arrived with a box of financial records. "I've found more," she said grimly. Gerald had been embezzling for 3 years, not 2. Small amounts at first, then larger sums as his debts grew. Nearly £12,000 in total. The full scope of Whitmore's crimes was staggering. He had betrayed everyone who trusted him, stealing from the living and the dead alike. Yet Miss Marple couldn't help but feel sadness for all involved. The desperate gambler, the grieving husband, the protective wife, all caught in a web of deception that had ended in tragedy. As evening fell, Inspector Slack made his decision. Both will be charged and let the courts decide the degree of culpability. Though given the circumstances, I suspect the sentences will reflect the provocations involved. Miss Marple watched as both suspects were formally processed, their dignified bearing maintained despite their circumstances. St. Mary Mead would survive this scandal, as it had survived others, but the scars would take time to heal. Chapter 8. The Melting Evidence. Boxing Day. Evening brought an unexpected thaw to St. Mary Mead. The temperature rose dramatically, and by morning the elaborate snow sculptures in the village square had begun to dissolve. Water ran in rivulets across the cobblestones, carrying with it the last physical remnants of the Christmas Eve tragedy. Miss Marple stood in the square with Inspector Slack, watching as the remaining frozen money packages were carefully extracted from the melting ice. Each bundle was photographed, catalogued, and matched against Mrs. Dawson's meticulous records of missing funds. "Look at this," Patricia Dawson said, consulting her ledger. The pattern of thefts increased dramatically 6 months ago. Before that, Gerald took small amounts, £50 here, 100 there. Then suddenly, he's taking thousands. When did his gambling debts escalate? Miss Marple inquired. Inspector Slack checked his notes from the London investigation. According to the syndicate's records, Whitmore got in deep after the Grand National last April, lost £5,000 on a supposed sure thing. And so began his desperate scheme to hide the money, Miss Marple observed. He knew the annual snow sculpture contest would provide the perfect temporary hiding place. Who would think to look inside frozen artworks? Young Tommy Fletcher and his sister had been allowed to return to the square, their parents keeping them close. Tommy approached Miss Marple shyly. "Miss, I remembered something else about that night. The person in the dark coat. They dropped something shiny in the snow. I went back to look for it this morning, but the thaw—" "What did it look like, Tommy?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Like a big silver egg with a handle. My gran had one like it on her walking stick." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. The silver handle from Mrs. Pemberton's walking stick, the murder weapon that had started the terrible chain of events. They found it an hour later, washed by the meltwater into a storm drain near the church hall. The heavy, silver piece bore traces of blood and hair, confirming its role in the crime. Reverend Clemson identified it immediately as belonging to his late mother-in-law. "Eleanor treasured that stick," he said sadly. "She said it made her feel her mother was still with her, supporting her steps." The irony of the statement was not lost on anyone present. That afternoon brought another revelation. Among Whitmore's personal effects, they discovered a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires, dated for January 2nd. He had been planning his escape for months, slowly converting the stolen funds into untraceable cash, hiding it in the sculptures he knew would be preserved until after the contest. "He never intended to return the money," Patricia Dawson said bitterly. "All his promises about investments and making things right, all lies." Miss Marple studied the travel documents. Yet, something made him accelerate his plans. These tickets were purchased just last week, though he'd been planning since summer. What changed? The answer came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Price Ridley arrived at the church hall, carrying a letter. This came for Gerald yesterday morning, but with everything that's happened, the postman only just remembered to deliver it to me as next of kin. The letter was from the London Gambling Syndicate. Its contents were chilling. "Final notice. Payment in full by December 26th, or we visit your charming village. We know about the church funds. We know about your plans. There is nowhere you can run." They were coming for him, Inspector Slack said grimly. Christmas Day was literally his deadline. Which explains his desperation when both Mrs. Clemson and Mr. Hewitt confronted him, Miss Marple noted. He couldn't return the money because he needed it to save his own life. Yet he couldn't access it until after the contest, when he could retrieve it without suspicion. The investigation was also revealing the full extent of the harm Whitmore had caused. Beyond the theft itself, they discovered he had falsified donation records, leading several families to believe their charitable contributions had been received when they had actually been diverted. The Hendersons, who had donated their insurance money after the fire, learned their contribution to the church restoration had never made it past Whitmore's gambling debts. Martin Hewitt, still in custody but calmer now, had provided a list of other veterans who had donated to his wife's memorial fund. Each would need to be contacted, their donations traced. The task would take weeks. As the sun set on Boxing Day, Miss Marple walked through the village, observing how quickly life was returning to normal. Children played in the slush, their laughter bright against the grey sky. Shopkeepers swept water from their doorsteps. The ordinary rhythms of village life reasserted themselves, as they always did after tragedy. Yet, in certain windows, curtains twitched as she passed. St. Mary Mead would not forget quickly. Trust, once broken, would take time to rebuild. The empty treasurer's position at the church would need filling, but who would want it now? Who would be trusted with it? The melting snow had revealed more than just hidden money. It had exposed the fragility of the social fabric that held their small community together, and the dangerous extremes to which desperation could drive otherwise good people. Chapter 9. Judgment and Mercy. The Crown Court at Much Benham was packed for the preliminary hearings. The curious case of Gerald Whitmore's death had attracted attention from London newspapers, their reporters cramming into every available seat. Miss Marple sat in the public gallery, her keen eyes observing not just the defendants, but also the assembled villagers of St. Mary Mead who had come to witness the proceedings. Martin Hewitt stood first, his military bearing evident despite the circumstances. His barrister, a young woman named Catherine Hartwell, whom his fellow veterans had helped secure, presented his case with careful precision. "My client does not deny striking Mr. Whitmore," she stated clearly. "However, we contend that this was a case of extreme provocation. Mr. Whitmore had stolen £3,000 donated in memory of Mr. Hewitt's late wife, money specifically intended for a hospital memorial wing." The prosecutor, Mr. Bartholomew, was less sympathetic. "Provocation does not excuse murder. Mr. Hewitt went to the church hall armed with an ice chisel. This suggests premeditation." "He carried his tools because he had been working on ice sculptures," Miss Hartwell countered. "The chisel was not brought as a weapon, but was used in a moment of overwhelming grief and anger." When Martin Hewitt took the stand, his testimony was powerful. He spoke of his wife Mary's final days, her determination that others should benefit from her suffering. "She sold her jewellery, everything of value we had to make that donation," he said, his voice breaking. "When Whitmore laughed about stealing it, something in me died." The judge, Mr. Justice Pemberton, ironically a distant relation of Mrs. Clemson's mother, listened gravely. "Mr. Hewitt, do you regret your actions?" "I regret taking a life," Hewitt replied steadily. "I don't regret stopping a man who was destroying everything good and decent about our community." Eleanor Clemson's hearing followed immediately. She appeared fragile but composed, dressed in sombre grey. Her barrister, Mr. Edmund Fairfax, took a different approach. Mrs. Clemson discovered that Mr. Whitmore had stolen £10,000 left to the church by her late mother. She confronted him seeking explanation and restitution. When he dismissed her concerns and turned his back, she struck him once with a walking stick, a single blow in a moment of profound emotional distress. The medical evidence proved crucial. Dr. Haydock testified that either blow could have been fatal, but determining which actually caused death was medically impossible. The combined trauma certainly killed him, but assigning primary causation to one blow over the other would be purely speculative. This unprecedented situation created a legal quandary. The judge called a recess to consider the unique circumstances. Meanwhile, in the corridor outside, the villagers of St. Mary Mead gathered in small groups, their opinions divided. "They should both go free," declared Mrs. Bantry, visiting from her seaside home. "Whitmore was a thief and a scoundrel." "But we can't have people taking justice into their own hands," countered Colonel Melchett. "Where would it end?" Miss Marple listened to these discussions with interest. She noticed Patricia Dawson standing apart, clutching a folder of papers. The church secretary approached her quietly. "Miss Marple, I found something else. Gerald had written confession letters, never sent. He apparently wrote them when drunk, then tore them up. I've pieced together what I could." The reconstructed letters were rambling and self-pitying but revealing. Whitmore had detailed his gambling addiction, his mounting desperation, and most significantly, his plans to fake his own death if necessary to escape his creditors. He was going to disappear completely, Patricia explained, leave everyone to clean up his mess while he started fresh in Argentina. When court reconvened, this new evidence was presented. It painted a picture of a man so lost to his addiction that he had betrayed every trust, stolen from the dead, and planned to abandon his responsibilities entirely. The judge's preliminary ruling was carefully considered. This case presents unique circumstances. Two individuals, acting independently, struck Mr. Whitmore within minutes of each other. Both had discovered his theft of funds that held deep personal significance. While the law cannot condone vigilante justice, it must also consider the extreme provocation involved. He recommended that both cases proceed to full trial, but suggested they be tried jointly, given the interconnected nature of the events. Bail was granted for both defendants, with conditions. As they left the courthouse, Reverend Clemson took his wife's arm, supporting her down the steps. Behind them, Martin Hewitt walked alone but not friendless. Several veterans from the British Legion flanked him protectively. Miss Marple watched them go, reflecting on how tragedy had revealed both the worst and best in human nature. Whitmore's greed had destroyed him, but it had also exposed the deep love Hewitt bore for his late wife, and the fierce protectiveness Mrs. Clemson felt for her mother's legacy. The money recovered from the sculptures would be returned to its rightful purposes. Mary Hewitt would have her memorial. Mrs. Pemberton's charity would reach the poor. But the cost had been terribly high, one life lost and two others forever changed. Chapter 10. When Snow Falls Again. 1 year later, Christmas Eve found St. Mary Mead blanketed once more in fresh snow. The village square bustled with preparation for the annual sculpture contest, though the atmosphere carried a subdued quality absent from previous years. Miss Marple, wrapped in her warmest shawl, stood observing the activities with her nephew Raymond, who had come down from London for the holidays. "It seems wrong somehow," Raymond commented, "holding the contest after what happened." "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied gently. "The village needs to reclaim its traditions. Otherwise, Gerald Whitmore's crimes steal more than just money. They rob us of our community spirit." The trial had concluded in late spring with verdicts that satisfied neither justice nor mercy completely. Martin Hewitt received 3 years for manslaughter with strong recommendation for early release. Eleanor Clemson was given a 2-year suspended sentence, the judge acknowledging both her previously exemplary character and the extreme provocation. Both verdicts had been met with relief in St. Mary Mead, where sympathy ran deep for the defendants. Martin Hewitt was serving his sentence at an open prison, where he taught woodworking to other inmates. His letters to the village spoke of finding purpose in helping others learn his craft. He would be eligible for release in 8 months with good behaviour. Eleanor Clemson had remained in the village, though she and the Reverend had moved to a smaller cottage. She worked quietly with the church accounts, having insisted on helping Patricia Dawson implement new financial controls. Every penny was now accounted for by 3 different people. "Look," Raymond said, pointing to a new addition to the square. A bronze plaque had been installed on the church wall. The Mary Hewitt Memorial Fund, supporting families through hospice care. Below it, fresh flowers lay in the snow. The sculpture contest proceeded with determined cheer. The new treasurer, Mr. Bartholomew, a retired bank manager with unimpeachable credentials, oversaw the donations with Patricia Dawson. Every transaction was recorded in triplicate, witnessed, and immediately banked. Trust would be rebuilt slowly, carefully. Young Tommy Fletcher, now a year older and taller, helped his sister with their snowman. He glanced occasionally toward the church hall, and Miss Marple noticed his lingering unease about that corner of the square. "Some memories fade slowly," she murmured to Raymond. "But they do fade, given time, and new, happier associations. As if to prove her point, a burst of laughter arose from near the bonfire where Philippa Hayes was demonstrating snow sculpting techniques to a group of children. The young woman had surprised everyone by remaining in St. Mary Mead after the trial. She had used her small inheritance to establish a craft workshop, teaching art to local youth. "I thought about leaving," Philippa had told Miss Marple months earlier. "But then I realised I'd be running from shadows. My father's mistakes aren't mine. Neither are Mrs. Blackwood's or anyone else's." The evening's judging was conducted by a committee rather than a single person, another change instituted in the wake of the tragedy. The winners were announced by Reverend Clempson, who had aged visibly but retained his gentle dignity. His parishioners had rallied around him, their support helping both him and Eleanor weather the storm. "The Henderson family wins first prize for their remarkable recreation of the church spire," he announced. The same family who had lost their donation to Whitmore's theft now received recognition and the £50 prize they sorely needed. As the celebrations continued around the bonfire, Miss Marple noticed a figure standing apart in the shadows. Mrs. Eleanor Clempson watched the festivities from a distance, as if afraid her presence might cast a pall over the joy. Miss Marple approached her slowly. "You should join them," Miss Marple suggested kindly. "Isolation serves no one." "How can I?" Eleanor asked, tears glistening in the firelight. "Every time they look at me, they remember." "They remember many things," Miss Marple replied. "Your years of service to the parish, your kindness to the sick, your mother's generosity. Yes, they also remember that terrible night, but memories needn't define us. It's what we do moving forward that matters." Tentatively, Eleanor moved closer to the fire. Mrs. Bantry immediately made space for her, and Patricia Dawson offered her a cup of mulled wine. The circle absorbed her naturally, conversation continuing without awkward pauses. As midnight approached and snow began falling again, Miss Marple reflected on the year's journey. Gerald Whitmore lay in the churchyard, his grave modest and rarely visited. The money he had stolen had been recovered and properly distributed. Mary Hewitt's memorial fund had already helped 3 families. Mrs. Pemberton's legacy supported the parish poor as intended. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said, joining her as the crowd began dispersing. "Do you think they'll ever truly forget?" "Forget?" "No," Miss Marple replied, watching the snow cover the square in fresh white. "But forgive. That's already beginning. See how they've included Mrs. Clempson, how they've honoured Mary Hewitt's memory, how they've rebuilt their safeguards. From tragedy, they're creating something better." The church bells began ringing, welcoming Christmas Day. The sound carried across the village, over the square where snow sculptures stood proud and untainted, past the church hall where shadows no longer lingered, and out into the countryside beyond. "When snow falls again," Miss Marple quoted softly, "nature offers us a clean slate. What we write upon it is our choice." As they walked home through the gentle snowfall, Miss Marple paused once more to look back at the square. The sculptures gleamed in the moonlight, purely decorative now, hiding no secrets, containing no stolen funds. They were simply what they appeared to be, expressions of creativity and community spirit. The case of the living snowman had taught St. Mary Mead valuable lessons about trust, justice, and redemption. Like the snow that would melt and return each winter, the village had learned to renew itself, carrying forward wisdom earned through pain but not dwelling in darkness. Tomorrow, children would play among the sculptures, families would take photographs, life would continue its ancient rhythm, and somewhere in an open prison a craftsman would be teaching another soul to create beauty from raw wood, finding redemption in the sharing of his gift. Miss Marple smiled slightly as she closed her garden gate. Human nature, with all its frailties and strengths, remained endlessly fascinating. Even in tragedy, perhaps especially in tragedy, the essential goodness of people could shine through, as bright and pure as fresh snow under Christmas stars. And so concludes our tale from Mindful Musings. I'm William, thanking you for joining us in St. Mary Mead tonight. Sometimes the deepest mysteries aren't about who committed a crime, but why, and whether redemption remains possible even after the greatest falls. Until next time, sleep well And remember, not all snowmen are as innocent as they appear.